Hi, CS260. This is Professor Jensen, and I'm going to continue our conversation about using React as our web framework by showing you how to use the React DOM router to navigate between your different components as the user clicks on links within your application. After we've got that in place, we've got enough information about how to use React to actually start porting our startup applications or our assignment application over to use React. In order to do that, we're going to introduce a new concept, which is tool chains, and these are programs that are chained together to actually take something that isn't viewable in the browser, convert it to something that does work in the browser, and then deploy it to a production environment. The core of our tool chain is going to be a program called Vite, and it's going to do two things for us. It's going to create that conversion from JSX that I just talked about, and it's also going to help us so that when we're in a development environment, it's going to set up a hot reloading HTTP debugger so that we can debug our React JSX code as we develop it. So let's jump right in. So we are working squarely to implement our React application more fully. Right now, for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to actually be in our dev environment to create our tool chain there and develop our React application that we're running. But we'll also use Vite to deploy, so we'll bundle up and transpile all of our JSX code to native JSS and HTML and CSS that a browser can interpret, and we'll use Vite to push that over into our production environment to serve it there, but we'll talk about that later. Let's first of all cover React Router so that we have all the pieces that we need in order to build a simple React application using our toolchain. So the React Router, the idea here is that if you have a multi-page application, web application, which is what you've had so far, then you've got a lot of duplication going on in your HTML. So you're going to have some sort of start and login page, which has the header and footer in there, and then it has the content in the middle of it. And if you click on any of the links and navigate to another page, then you're in a totally different context. The browser's going to reload everything again. And so you have to have that code either duplicated somehow or supplied by the server somehow. In our case, we just duplicated it. So we cut and paste those header and footers in every HTML page that we made within Simon. And whenever you navigate to another one, it loads the whole thing up again and renders it. So what we want to do is we want to use React and its ability to dynamically inject components into our application so that we don't have to duplicate that code. We can just dynamically inject the parts that we're missing and change around as the user navigates around the application. So this is where a single page application, or the concept of a single page application, comes into play. In a single page application, you're going to have a component for your header, you're going to have a component for your footer, and then you're going to have this empty kind of component in the middle here. And as your user navigates using the links that are available in your application, you're going to dynamically inject the main content area, whether that's scores or whether that's the gameplay or whether that's your login page, into that element that is represented there. So you only ever have one HTML page within your application. That's the index.html. And that means you're never changing context within the browser of what you've actually got loaded up. You load up that context once, you bring in your JavaScript once, and then you can just manipulate the DOM to actually provide the functionality of the application directly. So that's where we're headed. So to make that happen, we actually want to be able to click on the links and have it automatically replace the component that's being shown there with the one that the user clicks on. And that's where the React DOM router comes into play. So we're going to manipulate the DOM as we route different components to be displayed in response to a user clicking on the application. This is what it looks like. So you're going to import the DOM router, the React DOM router package into your program. And then you're going to get some root element. So in this case, we're just grabbing an element with an ID of root. And then our render function is going to return a component that's within that DOM router, React DOM router package, and it's called browser router. And that browser router is looking at every element within its children's scope, and it's looking for elements that are called navlink. And if one of those gets clicked on, then it's going to change what's actually going to be displayed in the element that's called routes. So within that routes element, it's going to display a different component. And the component that it knows to display is based upon the route that's defined on the link. So this one here is going to the /about route. So if we come down to our routes and we look for /about, we'll see our path matches there, and it's going to insert or inject the element that is the about element. So we go create a component that represents that element about, and it's going to be put in or injected into this area where the routes element actually is. And then if somebody clicks on something else like users, then it's going to find a match within the routes for the users, and it's going to render the user component in that place. So we've created a code pen for you that you can go out and look at. So we've got just our basic router, our basic root element that we're going to inject into. The HTML or the CSS is just to show different colors of what's actually being loaded there, so that's not super interesting. But we can see that it actually works. So as I click between my different links there, I'm actually rendering a different component. And this works because I've imported React and React DOM, but then I've also imported from a new package called React Router DOM the route element, the navigate element, the routes, and the nav link, and the browser router elements. And these are all the ones that you're going to need in order to produce a single page application where your routing is happening automatically to inject the components that you want to display. Then within our app that we're actually returning from our main level or top level application, we've got our browser router element there. And then I've just got a application there just to do a little rendering and using the CSS to make it look nice. And then I've got a nav application which has all my nav links. And you can see I've got a nav for home and user and about. Home goes to the root or the slash, users goes to users, and about goes to about. And then down in my main element, I've got my routes where all my injection is going to actually happen. So I click on this, the browser router component looks at its children, tries to find a map to that matches the to attribute of the nav link, and then replaces that component, the routes component, with the component that's specified as the element. Now my elements, I've got them just defined down here. There's really simple about, user, and home components to actually inject them in there. So you can see it working. As I click on this and back and forth, it's pulling those in there and displaying them. There's no new HTML page being loaded here. CodePen is not going to allow me to easily have a different HTML page loaded. So you can see that it's totally working by dynamically injecting that into a single page application. And that's the basics of routing. So your task is to play around with this and to add in another component to it so that you can demonstrate that you understand exactly what's going on with the DOM React router. All right, so with that in place, we've got everything that we need to build a simplistic, or to convert in a simplistic way the assignment application and also your startup application to utilize React. So the part that we're missing is the toolchain that will actually invoke Vite to do our Babel execution, to transpile our files, to minify the code, and to be able to build our static distribution that we're going to send out to our production environment. And also we're going to use Vite to use our HTTP hot reloading so that while we're in the development environment, we can see what our changes make as soon as we make them in our Visual Studio Code to see what they're actually doing in the browser. And that's what we're going to use our toolchain for. So the toolchain basically looks like this. After we've installed Vite, we can run npm run build, and that's going to invoke the script that actually executes Vite. It's going to load up Babel and transpile and polyfill and bundle up all our code. It's then going to run some other utilities for compressing the result down to something that's very efficient over the network. So it's going to remove all the white space, rename our variables so that they're really small, and make it as compact as possible. And then when you normally just build, like running npm run build, that's just going to put the output into a public directory so that you have all of your static files there. And if you're in production, you just take that directory and you deploy it. We have our Node.js server running. It reads that static public directory and serves up our application that is now a fully enabled React application. However, if we're in our development environment, we don't want to deploy this anywhere. We just want to create a temporary static rendering of our toolchain result and be able to have a hot reloading HTTP server that can read that static directory and host it and display it within the browser. So to do that, we use a script called npm run dev, and that invokes Vite, not in build mode, but in development mode, which will output the result of our minification and the rest of our toolchain, Babel and so forth, to a static directory where it will then read that directory using a hot reloading development HTTP server to actually render the result. So that's our toolchain. And we can actually go build this application right here using Vite pretty simply by I'll come back to this by running a couple commands. So the first command I want to run, we're going to escape out of here so we can actually run this, is an npm create. Now you haven't seen the create command with npm yet, but this is just a simple wrapper that dynamically goes and installs the package that you specify, so Vite latest, and runs it. And when I run it in this mode, it actually creates a template Vite application for me. So, and I'm telling it I want to use Vite and I want to use React templates to actually do that. So if I go grab this code right here and toggle over to my console window and paste this in, I'm going to go and grab Vite. I'm going to run it in a way that it's going to build a template project for me. It's going to name it Demo Vite, and it's going to use the React templates of that to show how React can be, or how Vite can be used to run React code. So I can go ahead and run that. It's asking me what my package name is, and I'm all set. So I can just cd. Do you see how fast that was? That's awesome. Vite's super fast. That's what it means in French, is fast. So if I go to Demo Vite and I do an npm install to bring down the packages for it, and once those are down, I can actually do npm run dev. And remember, this is going to do all my bundling for me. It's going to put it in this temporary static directory, and then it's going to launch an HTTP hot reloading debugger, so that HTTP server, so that I can actually see them in there. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And it gives me some help about what I can do. So I can push H and see that I can restart the server, or I can show what the URL of the server is, or I can open it automatically in the browser, or I can quit or clear the console. So if I do show the URL, it's showing me that I need to go talk on localhost 5174. And if I actually open that, then it will launch my browser, and you can see my result of the React application is actually there. And it's actually React, because I mean, like, I can interact with these components and it's actually doing something there. So let's go look at the code that it actually created. So I'm going to come back to my console and quit, and I'm going to open up VS Code, and we're going to stop this other thing that's running here in the background and just look at our demo Vite code here. So what I've got is, you've got a Vite configuration, which tells it, in this case, because I use the React plugin that we're using React, and that helps with debugging information. It's not necessarily required for what we're going to do, but that's what's going on there. We'll use the Vite config file to configure a different thing. We'll use it to configure how it interacts with our backend service. So if I go look at my code, Vite expects to find in the root of its directory the index.html file. And all that is doing is it's referencing off to in the source directory, a main.jsx file. And if I go over to the source, I'll actually find that main.jsx file. And all that's doing is finding the element with the ID of root, and it's rendering in the app component. And that app component is being read from app.jsx. So if I go over to app.jsx, I finally get to the end of my trail here, and I can see the actual JSX that it's rendering there. Let's go ahead and tweak it a bit so that we can see that the hot reloading is actually working. So I'm going to drop out these links at the top. I'm going to change it from Vite to React and just make that, CS 260. And I'm going to get rid of this paragraph at the bottom here. So that should work. Now, the component that's actually running here is the app component. You can see that I've got a hook here, a use state hook, that's setting a count, and it's creating a count state and allowing me to change that with the set count. So that's being rendered right here when you click on the button, and all it's doing is just incrementing count and then setting it to count. So I'm going to change this to be like +10 instead of just that, so that we can see that it's actually executing that JavaScript or that JSX also. I'm going to get rid of these references here because I deleted that out, and save that off. And if we toggle back over to our browser now, you'll actually see that, we killed our server. So I'm going to actually start that back up again here in the directory by doing npm run dev. There you go. And refresh there, and you can see that we see the result of our CS260, and the count is 0, but if we click on it, we're actually incrementing by 10 each time. So that's a really simple example of how you can use Vite to create a template application, and you can start building your application within that framework right away. And you don't have to do anything really super special to get JSX to work in there. Vite's smart. If it sees a file with a JSX extension, then it's gonna pass it off to Babel and automatically compile and use it that way. But what we really want to do now is to take what we've learned as far as building React components and what we've learned with actually using Vite to do our bundling for us and make it so that we can convert our Simon WebSocket application over to a React Simon application. And then you can follow that example to actually convert your startup application into one that uses React natively within your project. So I'm going to toggle over to the PowerPoint presentation again, and we've demonstrated how to use Vite with these commands here. And we want to make it so that when we're in a development environment, we can have Simon running with the Vite debugging service there. And whenever a request comes in for the server, because it's talking to that debugging service, it's going to proxy those requests over to our service. And then anything that's not in the service is going to get loaded up from that temporary directory where all the Vite bundles and compiled files are. So that's what we look like in development mode. In production mode, it's a little more simple. We're just running our Node.js service with our static middleware component, which will load up those bundled React applications that Vite created, and if it finds it in that public directory. Otherwise, it's looking for an endpoint to actually satisfy it. So that's kind of just the picture of what we're trying to actually build here. So let's take our first step. Let's go off to our console. We're going to quit out of here. We can close down Visual Studio Code and change directories back. And I'm going to actually do a git clone of our Simon WebSocket project. Change directory into that. And now I'm up and running. So I can actually open up code here. And this is the project that we basically reviewed here just earlier, talking about how WebSockets are done. And if I want to actually make this Vite enabled, then I've got to reconfigure how my project structure is done. So right now I've got in the root, I've got the actual service running. So my backend is in the root and my front end is in the public directory right in here. Now I want to actually flip that because I want Vite expects the project to have in its root its front end code. And so in order to make that work, I've got to flip those around. I'm going to put my service code into a service directory, and I'm going to move my front end code into the root directory. So the first step that I need to actually do is to move my service over. So I'm going to create a new directory, and I'm going to call it service. And I'm going to move database.js and index.js and my two package files and my proxy, which is doing my WebSockets, all over into that directory, the service directory. And I'm going to actually delete my deploy service because now that we're using the React Vite bundler to do it, we need a different deployment script. So this one's not going to work anymore, so I'm just going to whack it. And then you're going to have to go to the Simon React project example and see what that script is and use that one to deploy your code. So I've got everything over here. And if I do an npm install in that service directory, let's make this a little bit bigger. So if we change to the service directory and do an npm install to go ahead and get all the packages that Express requires, then we're good to go there. Now, just to be clear here, I've actually got two different npm packages going on here. One for my service and then one outside of that, which is going to do my Vite front end. I haven't actually gone and got Vite yet, so I don't have that in JSON or package.json yet. But I just created one here in the service directory so that I can actually go and do this. So with that in place, I can go and click on the index.js file and start it up using the Visual Studio Code debugger. It's going to ask, who I want to run this with. I'm going to say Node.js. It's going to start running, and it's going to immediately fail. And the reason it's going to fail is because I didn't actually bring in the DB config, so I can't talk to the database. So we got to fix that first. So let's go do that. Let's go back to our terminal here, and I'm going to copy from my desktop the db config file and put it in this directory. Awesome. So now I've got that there. I can go ahead and push F5 again, and if everything goes right, we should be able to see in our debugging console that it's listed on port 3000. So if I go back to my terminal now and just do a curl command for localhost on port 3000, and I hit my endpoint, API, user, and just say something like B for bud. Then I'm going to get that there is a user B, and it's currently not authenticated. So I know my service is running. That's great. So the next step is to actually make it so that I'm using Vite to actually load up my code, and that Vite knows how to pass requests through when they come in from the browser through its hot loading HTTP debugger over to my service that's also running. So to do that, I need to restructure my project a little bit more. So I'm going to stop my service running. I'm going to go over to my source code here. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. And we're going to look at the public directory. So this is where all my front-end code is. And what I want to do is, because Vite expects that front-end code to be in the root directory, I'm going to move it here. Now, don't despair. We're going to, when we start implementing React components, we're going to move those components into a source directory where all the React components are, and we'll slowly delete all of these front-end codes, except for the index.html, which was, and the index.jsx file, which will remain in the root and load everything else up from the source directory. So I'm going to go ahead and grab all of these here, and I'm just going to drag them down and put them right into my root directory. So that only left in my source my assets. Those are the sound files that we're going to use to play, and everything else is over in here. So now I can actually install Vite and have it load up that, those HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files that we've used before. So to do that, I'm going to go out to my terminal, my console window here, change back to my root directory, and right now I don't have, there's no there's no package.json file here, but I'm going to run the command to install Vite, the latest version, and I'm using the -D flag to tell it that I want it to be only used for debugging purpose, or not development purposes, because Vite's only used to bundle the code and to run when you're debugging, so I don't want it to be deployed when I actually send out code. So I'm going to put the -D on there to make sure that it's only used in the development environment. And I can go ahead and run that. Now that's going to create my package.json file automatically for me. Now, because I didn't run npm init, I don't have those other metadata things, but that's okay. I'm just trying to demonstrate this really quickly, that you now have a dev dependency on Vite, and it's installed that dependency in the node modules directory, which is right here for the root of the project, which is our front-end root code. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to define some scripts within my package.json that I'm going to use to actually run Vite. So I defined 3 scripts. One is dev, which means I want to run Vite, and the default mode for Vite is just development mode. So it's going to bundle everything up, put in a temporary directory, and then launch a hot reloading debugger to actually pull that data, those files out, and serve them up to the browser. And then it will launch that browser for me, as I just demonstrated a couple minutes ago. I've also got a build script. This runs Vite, but it runs it in build mode, which means it's not going to launch the debugging debugger, or the HTTP debugger. It's just going to bundle up all that code, and it's going to put it in a build directory that we can then deploy to our production environment. And the last one is preview. So if you want to also do a build, but you want to run it in your your browser to actually see your build, you can use Vite preview to have it pull from that build directory, that distribution directory, instead of the temporary one that you would normally get when you were doing the dev command. So that's all good and all in place. So if I've got that right, I should be able to come here and do npm, and we're going to do run, and we're going to do dev. And that should start it all up, and it's going to look in the root directory for our index.html, and because these files are all relative to that, it should load our whole application up. So I'm going to bring that up there, and I can push help and push open to actually have it opened up in the browser, and it opened it up off my screen. So I'm just going to drag that back over here, and you can see that it's on that port that we told it that we're launching from. If I come here, you can see that it was 5173. And we've got that there, 5173. Now, I want to open up the dev tools and take a look at what's actually going on here. So let me just do a refresh. We can get rid of our console. And I'm going to try and log in. So I'm going to do B and P for my password and push login. And you can see I'm actually getting an error here. And the error is that we got a 404, an unknown error, because it's trying to call an endpoint on the server. through the hot reloading debugger that Vite is actually running. So the first problem here is that we actually shut that server down, so it's no longer running. So let's go ahead and start that back up again. So if I go to service and go to index and push F5, it's going to attach node and attaches debugging environment, and we should be good at this point. So if I refresh again, do a hard reload, let's go ahead and put B and P in here again and try and log in. I'm still getting a 404. So the problem is that I'm not redirecting those requests that are going to the Vite HTTP debugger over to the service, the backend service, which is listening on port 3000. You can see that this is going straight to port 5173. So I need to actually tell Vite when it's running as a debugger that it needs to proxy those requests. And the way you do that is you go to your project. I can minimize some of this so we can see what's going on here. And I'm going to create a new file. And this is the Vite configuration file. And you name it the magic name Vite config.js. And then within there, you tell it how to route requests that it doesn't know how to handle. And this looks like this. So I'm going to import the defined config from the Vite package. And then I'm going to say I want the server to act as a proxy, and if you get a request that begins with API, then I want you to route all of those to localhost 3000. And if you get a request that has a path of WS, meaning it's one of those WebSocket requests, I want you to route those to the WebSocket protocol, and I'm telling it that it needs to use the WebSocket protocol to actually do this. So those two entries right there make it so that we actually can fulfill what our desired diagram was, which is the API and the WebSocket requests will come into Vite's debugging HTTP server and get routed over to, whoops, that's not, there you go, get routed over to our Node.js service application that's running on port 3000. Anything that doesn't match those two is just going to go straight through and go to that temporary directory where it's bundled everything and load those files up there. So that's great. I think we're good to go. So now we can show that it works. We should probably like restart this just to make sure that it brings up that configuration. So I'm going to quit, and then I'm going to bring up that again, and we can just toggle over here to our WebSocket code and refresh this and make sure it's got it. And I'm going to log in now as Bud and password and log in, and we get a 4000 again. That's not good. Oh, yeah, I forgot to save. So come back, save. That actually forced the restart there. If we come back again, you can see that it's reloaded. And let's just see if this pulls it up this time. So if I log in, and now we're good. You saw really quickly that it actually hit the endpoint, pulled it over, and displayed that. If I go to scores, you can see it's actually pulling from the server and from my backend database what those scores were. About works fine, play works fine. The whole app is now running under Vite. So that's not super exciting in and of itself because we've just like stuck this another layer in here, which actually made it a little more difficult to debug. But now I have the ability to write JSX, and Vite will do all the magic for me to actually do JSX. And that's what we're really shooting for with using Vite. So I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to demonstrate that this works by changing our main page application so that it actually becomes more of a React application. So if you look at what we have in our root directory, we have a index.html file, which is just our standard HTML file. And this really isn't in our assignment application an index.html file. It's not. It's actually a login file, but we wanted that to be the first thing that the user saw when they logged in, so we just named that one. So I'm going to rename that. We're going to come over here and we're going to rename that to login.html. And instead, I'm going to create a new file, which actually is our index.html file. And this is going to be our single page or application for React. And if you go back over here, you can see, oh yeah, it's just returning nothing now because I don't actually have any code in here. But if I actually, put something in here like h1, hello, then you can see it's actually working there. So index.html is working fine. But I want it to be a React kind of index.html file. So to enable that, I'm going to just blow in some code here, which sets up my template of how a React index.html file would look like. And this is pretty simple. It brings it in a favicon. It makes sure that we have our viewport so that our CSS renders properly. We've got a theme color, and then I've got a title for the thing that we're trying to move to, Simon React rather than Simon WebSocket. Single page applications don't work if JavaScript isn't enabled, so we have the tag in here that says, hey, you need to enable JavaScript if you don't have it running. And then we've got our root element with an ID of root, and then we're just bringing in a file called index.jsx, which is our first JSX component that we're going to use to render everything else into it. So I need to create that too. So I'm going to come here and create a new file. We're going to call that index.jsx. And then I need to actually have some JSX in there to actually render. And since this is our top level component, we're going to need to bring in React and DOM React, and we're going to actually render, finding our root component and injecting the element that we want to render into this. Now, we've skipped a few steps here that are really important. First of all, we haven't actually imported the React component packages in order to make this work. If we go look at our package.json, all we've got in here is Vite right now. So we need to make sure that happens. So let's go ahead and import those components. I'm going to come down here to my terminal, and we're going to quit out of Vite and paste in an npm install. And I'm going to install the basic React package, the one for manipulating the DOM, and I'm also going to bring in my React router DOM so that we can do our React router in a little bit here and install all 3 of those. So now that will be brought in, and you can see our dependencies, which aren't dev dependencies, these are actually production ones that are required. So all of that JavaScript will get bundled up and sent out with our application when we go. And I also want to bring in a couple other packages that are going to make things easier for me. So Simon's set up to use Bootstrap in some limited ways. And we want to make sure that we're not going to a CDN anymore to get those Bootstrap things, that we want to be able to just load them straight from our code repository, from the package that we actually deploy. And we also want to take advantage of React's ability to wrap those Bootstrap components and then just use native Bootstrap components to actually execute things like buttons and modals instead of using the CSS that comes from Bootstrap to render that. So I'm going to bring in those 2 packages too. Bootstrap is just the Bootstrap CSS files, and React Bootstrap is the React components to wrap some of those Bootstrap functions. So I'm going to go ahead and bring those in too while we're at it. Okay, so now I'm up and running. If we go back to our index.jsx file, I'm going to close up a couple of these here. We don't need to see that one anymore. We don't care about that one. And you can see that this is actually bringing in a component and rendering it here, but I'm going to simplify this right now because I just want to make sure it's working. So I'm going to comment out that component, and instead of rendering an app component, which we haven't looked at, I'm going to just render some JSX directly in here. So I'm going to do div and hello React. So that literally is JSX that we're bringing in right there, and I'm going to save that. So if that works right, then we should have our data coming across here. Unfortunately, we're getting an error because we shut down Vite. So we need to open up Vite again. So I'm going to do npm run dev, and that will open up Vite. And if we go over to our browser, you can see that hello React actually goes. So that's our first example of a React component actually running from our development environment that we've actually rendered within it. And now we just need to start building on top of that to bring over all of our components and to put the React router in there and make the whole thing into a full-fledged React application. But that's super exciting. So I feel like taking a break, getting a drink of water, go getting a cookie or something like that, and say, yeah, I deployed, I created my first React application using Visual Studio Code. So let's take it a little bit further. I'm going to go ahead and re-enable this right here, and I'm going to put all my React components in a directory which is called source. So a new folder, src, and I'm going to in here. I'm going to create a file. Which we're going to call app.jsx. That's going to be our application JSX. And within our application JSX, I'm going to just paste in kind of a placeholder component. So I'm going to grab some template code here and paste it in. This is just bringing React. It's using the Bootstrap package that we just installed. And it's also referencing a CSS file, which we don't have quite yet. So I'm going to comment that out. And then I've just got this app that I'm exporting from here. So if I save that, come back over to my index.jsx, you can see that I'm importing that thing there. It's using the default on the export, so that is the only thing that's going to be passed back from the app is that one app function. And then I can actually use that to render it. So what we expect to actually have happen is you're going to say your app will display here, and it should have some of our Bootstrap kind of CSS on there. If we toggle back over, you can actually see that our app component inside our index.jsx is actually getting rendered in there. So now we got two levels of JSX going on there. Let's go ahead and bring in some CSS to make things look a little bit better. And what I want to do is this becomes now my main top level component for my application, whereas before it was index.html, now it becomes apps, the app component. So before, when I had the when I had my main CSS, that was kind of my top level one. And I'm just going to drag that up into my service code, or to my source code here, and I'm going to rename it so that it's app CSS instead of the main one. And that's what I'm going to reference here to bring that in, and then all of those styles should automatically be displayed and handled on there. There's not a whole lot going on here because we're just doing that top level thing, so you don't see anything different. But if I hadn't done that, then the application would look really funny as we started bringing in more and more functionality. So I've got that there. I've got my app component rendered, and it's just doing your app will display here, and it displays in a minimal kind of way. Now I need to actually implement some functionality coming in here. And if we go look at our index.html, what I want to bring in, not our index, but our old index.html, which is now located in login.html, you can see that it's got some of the stuff that I want to bring over. So this is going to be, if we go back and look at our diagram that we had in here, this is going to be, the app component is going to have the header and the footer, and then it's going to inject in these different components in here as you navigate on these different buttons right here. So that's where we're going for. The only other thing that I want to show just quickly, this is kind of what our app looks like. We have our index.html, which references our main.jsx, which loads up our app.jsx and actually displays our application. And that's as far really as we've gotten, but it's about to get a whole lot better. So if I go and grab this code out of here, we want to grab the header, we want to grab the footer. Let's actually grab the whole body. So I'll grab the whole body, which will have the header, footer, and the main component. And I'm going to just grab this all over and bring it across to my application JSX. And I'm going to just paste this in here because, you know, JSX is also HTML, so that should work-ish, kind of. And I can get rid of that semicolon. I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup here. I don't need to bring in JavaScript anymore. I'm importing Bootstrap using the package instead of using a CDN, so I can get rid of that. I don't need my modal dialog. I'm going to get rid of, in fact, I don't want any of this stuff in the main anymore, because we're going to inject each one of the components to represent our content as we go along. So I'm just going to put that there, and I'm going to put something as simple like, components go here for the future. Then I've got my header, and it's going to return that there. If I save that, it's going to inject parentheses around it because it wants to, have the JSX returned as just the single parameter of your return object there. So that's interesting. We do have some problems, which is we've got a body tag here, and if I go back to my my index.html, there's already a body tag, so I don't want to have a body tag within a body tag. So I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to actually make this just a div instead, but I still want the styling that I had on there, so I'm actually going to put a body style, which is a little wonky. I could call it something else, like the app style, for example. And come down here and change my body to a div on that. And then I need to go to my CSS, which I'm bringing in here. Instead of being that, I'm going to have a style, which is .app, and have that going on there. So if I did that right, then it should have loaded that all up, and it should be bringing in my header and just a main placeholder for my components, and then my footer there. So let's toggle over and see how that looks. And there you go. It's awesome. We've got a header kind of coming in. We've got our components going in here. I've got a space for my footer. There's something going wrong with my styling here. I mean, it's there, but it's like the wrong colors. So I'm just going to quickly tweak that without really figuring out too much about what's going on there. I'm going to take off the muted and the dark and just make this light so that we can actually see those showing up there. And now we see all the different parts coming in here. And that's great. So, yep. And it looks like when we brought things over, we lost some navigations here. Maybe I was too aggressive. So I'm going to actually show you how you can convert this over. So I'm just going to go grab, I've already messed around and tweaked with that a little bit, and I properly pulled it over, but it looks like I deleted some of the menu options when I brought that over. So I'm going to go ahead and bring the whole thing over just from some template code that I've already got over here, which is very much the same. It just has all the navigation options. Paste that in there. I've got to fix this styling again really quickly to be white. And now if I toggle over here, you can see I've got all of them coming in here, but my styling is kind of wonky, and that's because I called it body here. I changed it to app. So now you can see it's totally working great. All those main styles are being applied there. I've got my headers and footers. I can like click on these. They're links. They're going to somewhere because they're actually going to that HTML that's still in my root directory, but it's kind of wonky at this point because I've got part converted over React and not part converted over React, but that's okay. As we migrate each one of those components over to be React components, then we'll delete them out of our root directory and move them over into our source directory as components. So that's looking good. I'm feeling pretty great about things at this point. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to create view components for each one of our home, play, about, and scores so that it looks like what our target is here, where we've got components for each of those there and we're dynamically injecting in them there. So to do that, I want to go to my source directory and I'm going to create a new folder for each one of my components. So I'm going to do a login folder, and in here I'm going to create a new file. And I'm going to call that login.jsx, and I'm going to stick my JSX component here. And I'm just going to go grab really quickly a very simple JSX component, which is just exporting a function called login, which represents the login component, and all it does is says the login component is displayed here. And that's going to go right into a main element, and that means that it's going to like get stuck right in here. So instead of displaying this placeholder here, I want to actually display our login component. And I'm just going to plaster that right there. And then I need to import that. So I'm going to import, if I can type correctly, import. And I'm going to use object destructuring to actually get the login component. And that's because if we toggle over here, it's not using default, it's just putting it inside the exported package, which means I need to destructure that out of there. And then I'm going to pull this in from, and we're going to pull it in from /login/login. And if we spell from right, then things will be a lot better. You can see it's able to find that. I got no errors there, and that should actually display our login component there. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And if we worked, which we didn't, we would have seen that actually being rendered there. So I got an error. Let's go and see what that says. It says the requested module source login JSX does not provide an exported name login. Okay, that's helpful. So let's go look here. I'm importing from login, and oh, there's the problem. We just didn't save it. So we've saved it, and now bam, you can see login displayed here. If I change this and put an exclamation point on there and save it again, you can see that hot reloading that Vite is doing for me, automatically bringing that in there. So I can quickly like iterate and see what the results of things are within the browser. So that's awesome. That's my first component. Now I need 4 more of these. So I'm just going to really quickly copy this and paste it and paste it and paste it. So I've got 3 copies of my login one, and I'm going to rename it. So I've got an about, and I'm going to rename the file to about, and I'm going to go in here, and instead of returning login, I'm going to return about. And I'm going to say that about is displayed here. Save that. I'm going to go to my other one here, and I'm going to rename this one to scores. And I'm going to rename the file here to be scores.jsx. And then I'm going to edit that one there. So this returns scores. And it's going to display scores displayed here. And then my last one, I've got about, I've got scores, and I need to have my play. So we're going to have a play directory here, and I'm going to rename this file to be play.jsx and open that up and change it from login to play. And we're going to come down here and we're going to say, play is displayed here. Now, assuming I got all of those named correctly, which I probably didn't, but hopefully we've got our 4 different placeholder components in here. And I could test one of them out by going to app JSX and bring in the other 3 that we actually need. So I'm going to bring in those three, and I'm going to import about, and we're going to bring that in from about / about, and I'm going to bring in one from scores / scores, and I'm going to bring in my last one from play to / play, and rename the actual variable that gets assigned to it from our object structuring to be play, and we're going to bring in scores here. Okay, so all of those are now. Visual Studio Code says, hey, you're not using these yet. That's okay, we will be using them in a minute. But let's just make sure that we can actually display them all, or at least a couple more. So in addition to login, let's go ahead and do scores. Bring that in here. Oh, might as well bring them all in. Let's see what it looks like. It's going to be kind of wonky, but so we got about, we got play, and we got scores, and we got, no, we don't have play. That's what we're missing. So there we go. So we got all 4 of them in here. So if I come back over here and look, and we saved. We've got all 4 of them. And log, oh yeah, sorry, there they are. They're just, you got to scroll down to actually see them all, because they're all in there. So we don't really want that. We don't even really want one of them, but we'll replace that in a minute here with the router. So that's the starting place of changing all of our components over to be React components. I'm just creating these little placeholders, and then I'm going to move that functionality from each of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that I implemented in that project over into those components, and then I'll delete the files out of the root directory so that when we're totally done, all we have is an index.jsx and an index.html in the root, and those are all calling the components up inside the source directory to actually render the application. So the next thing that I want to show you is the ability to actually implement the router. So we already brought in the npm package to do the router, but we need to actually bring those into our application JSX file. So I'm going to come in here, and in addition to these other ones, I'm going to import the browser router, navlink, route, and routes that I demonstrated earlier into this process. And I then need to come in here, and I need to wrap my entire application with that browser router. And we'll go down to the bottom, and we'll put this in here at the bottom. Make sure it's an end tag, that all formats nicely. And that shouldn't change anything in here. It just got that in there, but until I start actually executing the nav links, then it's not going to do anything. So if I click on these links right now, it's still going to, well, there you go. It's going to do some wonky things. So we need to fix that. So I need to convert all of these links here to actually be over to nav links. So in order to make that happen, I'm going to go to each one of these anchor tags with the classes on here, and I'm going to convert those over. Oh, I failed to mention one thing. When I pasted those in here, I actually renamed class, which was the official CSS or the HTML elements for putting in a CSS style in there to make it so you can import those styles using class names, to the React version of it, which is class with a capital N name. And the bundler, Babel, will convert those over to be the correct HTML elements when it outputs it. But I can't conflict with these right now because React wants to know what these actual class names are so that I can dynamically manipulate them. So we did have to rename everything from class to class name when we brought them in. And now I'm going to do a kind of a similar thing here with all of these elements. I'm just going to go ahead and select all of them and work on them all at the same time. So I'm going to change my anchor tags to instead be a nav link. And I can leave the class names on there as fine. I can come in here, and we're going to just navigate over really quickly, and I'm going to pull the HTML extension off and just use the name as our path, and then I just need to change href to be 2 instead of that. And then we need to go down. If I get this out of the way, which is going to mess up everything. I'm going to go down, we'll select these ones here, and I'll change these tags to be the end tag for the nav link. Now we're all good. I converted my anchor tags over to be nav links, and that allows the browser router to be able to intercept when those links are actually clicked on and send them to the paths indicated by the 2 attribute on it. So now the only other thing I have to do is replace this login with the routes that we actually want to navigate to. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that in, some code here that shows you all of that, and pop that right here. We'll save that so it formats. And now you can see whenever those nav links are hit, it's going to, if you hit oh, we want to get rid of index because we don't have an index component path. We just have the root path. We want that one to be the root. So I'm going to put that one there. So if you get nothing, you're going to get the login component. If you go to play, then you're going to get the play component and so forth all the way down. Now I stuck in an extra one here. This is the bonus. Like if none of those paths match, I don't want it to freak out. I want it to actually display something. So the star path goes to a not found component. So we need to actually implement that not found component. And I'm just going to stick it right up in here within our application. And it's internal, so I don't need to export it or anything. And it's just going to display, 404 return to sender if you give it a bogus thing. So in theory, I can save that. And we can go over here to our browser. And you can see right away, it doesn't know what index.html, so it's using that default one right there. But if I click on home now, you can see that I'm actually getting the routing working, and all of those links are working perfectly. That's cause to celebrate. We've made great progress. We've gotten Vite running. We got our basic application running with the JSX components put in there. And then we were able to actually build placeholder components for all of our different views in our application. And we're able to actually navigate them using the DOM router. So that's a good place to just go take a break. You've got your app running. You want to make sure you commit that and save that. You don't want to deploy it yet because you don't want to overwrite your production application, but you can certainly commit that to your GitHub repository so that you don't lose that. Okay, so the next thing is just to go and convert all of those things over. But I'm going to save that for a later discussion. I just wanted to show you how to start getting your React application or your startup application converted over to React to begin with, so that you can actually start playing with components. You can start playing with the DOM router within your application. We're going to learn a couple more things. We're going to learn another hook, use effect, and a couple more things about React, and then you'll be all ready to actually port your full application over to use it. So I hope you're excited, that you have lots of fun. Make sure you walk through the example with Simon to actually see how things are done there, and that will help you out a ton when you start porting your application over.